In the past, much of the wetland area on the western side of Titusville drained westward towards the St. Johns River Basin. A relic dune ridge formed a natural barrier between Wetlands 2 and Wetlands 3, blocking eastward flow. In fact, the basin boundary between the St. Johns River Basin and the Indian River Lagoon Basin runs right through the center of that upland dune ridge island that sits in the middle of the 3405 wetlands. The natural westward flow from Wetlands 1 and Wetlands 2 was permanently altered during the mid-20th century when a series of ditches and drainage projects were constructed to divert water east into the Indian River Lagoon for agricultural and residential development. Wetlands 1 has the highest elevation. Like all the other wetlands in Titusville, Wetlands 1 is a receptacle for stormwater. Not only does it collect rain that falls into the wetland, it gathers water from the neighborhoods that surround it because they have no stormwater infrastructure. Water just flows down the streets and ditches and into the wetland. On its southern route, water squeezes through a tiny opening between two dune ridges in the southwestern corner of Wetlands 1. An old berm forces the water into the northeastern corner of Swan Lake, which is a large borrow pit that's adjacent to the Swan Lake subdivision. Probably provided fill for the Swan Lake subdivision. Water then travels south and exits at the southeastern corner of Swan Lake. From there, the water moves southeast and into Wetlands 2 through a culvert that's under State Road 405. Moving water through that culvert is like using a tiny straw to drain a 5-gallon bucket. After squeezing through the culvert under State Road 405, the water moves northeastward towards Wetlands 3 because the elevation of Wetlands 2 is higher than that of Wetlands 3. Wetlands 2 is separated from Wetlands 3 by Lake Dobson and the island of upland habitat that rests between the 405 wetlands. Lake Dobson is not a natural lake. It's a large borrow pit where dirt was excavated in the 1950s to provide elevation and fill for building foundations of the surrounding homes in the Country Club Estates subdivision. Construction of Lake Dobson opened a pathway for water that had historically moved west to instead move eastward from Wetlands 2 toward Lake Morebecca because water runs downhill. Wetlands 2 is also fed by older neighborhoods that were built long before stormwater holding infrastructure was required. The Heritage Ditch is a major conveyance that funnels water from the top of the ridge by Park Avenue down to Lake Dobson. After passing through Lake Dobson, water moves eastward into Wetlands 3. The eastern terminus and the lowest elevation of Wetlands 3 is Lake Morebecca. To increase development potential and water control, Lake Morebecca's drainage system has been managed through ditches and pipes. Based on the history of stormwater management in Titusville, it's highly likely that Lake Morebecca was larger and maintained higher water levels before the construction of its drainage system to manage stormwater in the St. John Street Basin, which is the largest sub-basin in Titusville's Area 2 watershed. The St. John Street Basin functions as a treatment drain for stormwater, managing runoff from approximately 555 acres of commercial and residential land before it reaches the Indian River Lagoon. The main goal is to improve stormwater quality, reducing the environmental impact on the lagoon. An open ditch moves water from Lake Morebecca to ponds located at the North Brevard Senior Center. During heavy rain events, flooding occurs along the way in the Baker Subdivision and Temple Terrace when water backs up on its eastern journey. Floating vegetated island mats were installed in the ponds in December of 2015. They contain floating wetland plants that absorb excess nitrogen and phosphorus. From the senior center ponds, water passes through a culvert under Park Avenue and into ponds at the Royal Palm Apartments. At the eastern end of the Royal Palm Apartment ponds, the majority of stormwater enters an underground pipe, which goes east under West Street and then south below an open field where it turns and heads east. The pipe goes under residential neighborhoods and under the Florida East Coast Railroad track and then under St. John Street on the other side of the railroad track. It passes under US 1 and Indian River Avenue and exits into the Indian River at the eastern end of St. John Street. I guess that's why they call it the St. John Street Basin. A second pathway for stormwater to reach the lagoon is also at the east end of the Royal Palm Apartment Pond, where stormwater enters an open ditch and heads north towards South Street. There it enters an underground pipe and continues eastward underneath South Street to its terminus at the Indian River. Unfortunately, draining fresh water into the Indian River is bad for the river. Sudden surges into the lagoon from torrential freshwater injections can stress or kill marine species that require specific salt levels in order to survive. Regarding freshwater drainage into the St. Johns River Basin, there are some culverts under I-95 that are north of State Road 50 that are supposed to move water west into the St. Johns River floodplain. I'm not sure how much water gets to the culverts or where it goes if it actually makes it through them, because the ditches on both sides of I-95 are clogged by years of vegetation growth. While historical drainage was once common to transform wetlands, modern efforts have focused on restoration and preserving the remaining wetlands and their buffers to provide ecological functions and manage stormwater. That's exactly what we need to do with the State Road 405 wetlands.